Hello and welcome back. So today we're going to look at the top 5 buy low candidates in net, guys who are due for a bounce back season and may give you great value during your draft, depending on where they're going, of course. Now, disclaimer, the rankings used for this video are for a category league with standard goalie categories, goals against, save percentage, wins, and shutouts, and the results may vary for points leagues. Now, the ratings used are those 4 categories plus a games played percentile, goals saved above expected, and a team expected goals against per game, which gives us a sense of whether the goalie is a heavy starter, whether he's skilled, and whether he's playing behind a good defensive team. And those are all things we look for in fantasy goaltending. But this is an analysis project, so what went into it? What are the criteria for being a buy low candidate? Some of these are, my opinion is added into the data, but for the most part, this is all a data exercise. So we're looking for guys that are hovering around a 5-year average or are on an upward trend over the last 4 seasons until 22-23 when they fell off. A minimum goalie rating of 35. Anything lower than that, you're not going to want to own for the most part. They're backups or they're guys who have seen a minimal amount of starts. And then we want a 5-point deviation either from their 5-year average or from their 21-22 season. So we'll get into that a little bit in more detail as we look at each goalie specifically. So let's start at number 5 and work down to number 1. And we'll start with a guy who definitely needs a bounce back season, and that's Ville Husso. So 51 rating, his 5-year average 59.35, that's a 13.82% deviation, but his 21-22 rating an 86.24. You can see that on the graph over here, way above where he was the past 2 or the other 2 seasons. That's a 40.69% deviation. And one of the reasons for that could be the fact that he's never started this many games. So in 2021, he started 15 games. He was 9-6-1 with an 893 and a 3.21 goals against. In 21-22 for St. Louis, he had 38 starts, 25-7-6, excellent record, 919 save percentage, and a 256 goals against. And then last year, he started 56 games, 26-22-7, so still above 500, but an 896 save percentage and a 3.11 goals against. So what about that 21-22 season in St. Louis when he kind of popped off and earned his money that he got in free agency with Detroit? Was St. Louis elite defensively and then he comes to a worse defensive team? Well, not really. At 21-22, St. Louis was 18th in the NHL in expected goals against. Last year, Detroit was 13th. So they actually were better than the St. Louis team that he put up all those good numbers for. So he maybe just had to adjust to being a starter. This year he's getting some support. They bring in James Reimer. So now he's a 1A, 1B. They're maybe going to try to limit his starts a little bit more. Maybe he's going to be in that 45 to 50 start range, and instead of that 50 to 55 start range. But either way, he's looking for a bounce back because if he could regress somewhere in between these 2 numbers, he was at a 55 this past year, 86 the year before. If he splits the difference, you're looking at a guy who's probably a really solid 1A or 1B, depending on how many starts he's going to get. And he's on a team that's trending in the right direction. People are projecting the Detroit Red Wings to improve. You have an elite defenseman in Mo Seider in front of him, blocking shots, hitting guys, etc. They've improved their offense, so he's probably going to get some more goal support this year. The main problem last year was his goals saved above expected, minus 14.69. That was 6th worst in the NHL, and that's going to correlate with his save percentage being so low as well. So if he can just turn up that save percentage a little bit, hopefully now he's more accustomed to where the shots are going to be coming from, and that could help him point his arrows back in the right direction. So this is the number 5 candidate. Let's take a look at another guy who's a 1A, 1B situation who could definitely use a bounce back season, and that's Jack Campbell. So Jack Campbell, a 38.27 last year. That is a massive drop. 36% deviation from his 5-year average. It's a 45% deviation from his 21-22 rating, and that's not even his highest rating. So he dropped from a 77 all the way down eventually to a 45. Now, the one thing that concerns me is that he does have this floor. So this other season, 19-20, he was a 45.83, and then he's back down to a 45. So is this where he should rest, or should he be closer to his median, which is, in the 70 range? So 71, 69, and then a 77. I would argue he's closer to a 70 type of goalie. He just had a really bad season last year. So there is good news. So let's start with the bad news, I guess. 888 save percentage is atrocious. 3.41 goals against. He was, I believe, the third worst in terms of goals saved above expected. I could be wrong about the positioning, but he was definitely in the bottom 5 in the entire NHL last year. He just had a horrible season. Coming over from Toronto, did not adjust really well and lost the net to Stuart Skinner. And you will see Stuart Skinner's name right here on the graph. He was one of the top 15 or 20 goaltenders in the NHL last year for fantasy purposes. So he did lose the net. It was a bad season. But if you're looking for a silver lining, here's his numbers in the regular season. So he was 77th in low danger save percentage, 59th in medium danger save percentage, 83rd, which is 4th worst in high danger save percentage during the regular season. But in the playoffs, he was 2nd in the NHL in low danger save percentage, 10th in medium danger, and 1st in high danger. So when the chips were on the table, when he had to elevate his game because they had to pull Stuart Skinner, it was a limited sample size, but he did elevate his play to the levels that we were seeing the previous couple seasons in 21-22 and 2021. So he did kind of turn it around a little bit, but it was a little bit too little, too late. Another pro in his column, Edmonton last year was 10th in expected goals against. And that was with Ekholm coming in at the deadline, which is around February 28th. So if you look at the stats before they got Matthias Ekholm, they were 17th in goals against per game at 3.17. After they get Ekholm, they jump all the way up to 7th in the NHL, 2.67 goals against per game. So a full year with Ekholm in front of him, and then hopefully just you can't be as bad as this again. If he is, he's probably going to be out of the league, going to get bought out, that type of thing. So there is added motivation for him to improve his game. I think he's the kind of guy who works hard and wants to be good. It's just it didn't happen for him for the first 40 games or so last year, maybe even a little bit further than that. But he seemed to turn it around in the playoffs, and that's what you're hoping for. If you're looking for Jack Campbell, obviously you're going to want that exposure to the Edmonton offense if you're in a points league that favors wins, because he's the type of goaltender that his save percentage might not be great, but his record might be okay just because of the goal support he's going to get. So that's what we're looking for Jack Campbell. But let's move on to number 3, a guy that I was high on last year, and he should be high on my list again this year. And that's Philip Grubauer. 51 rating last year, 65 5-year average, a 22.46% deviation from that 5-year average. And you can see here, this is an interesting trend graph. So 66, 73, 92.61. He got some Vezina love that year in terms of voting. Drops all the way down to a 44 in his first year with Seattle. Kind of bumps back up a little bit to a 60. So this is an interesting case file because I said last year that he would be a good buy low, bounce back candidate. And that did kind of happen for his goals against. So his goals against went from a 3.16 in 21-22 to a 2.85 in 22-23, but it was not true for his save percentage. And the Kraken had to rely on Martin Jones to kind of bail them out, which was not in the best interest of Grubauer owners because obviously you would want him to take over the net and have a bunch of the starts. So we have a good goals against average and a really bad save percentage. He got not enough wins in terms of the raw numbers. The record was not as good as Martin Jones. But here's the detail that I was pointing to last year that I'm going to bring up again. Every single season, partial or full, prior to joining the Kraken, he never dipped below a .915 save percentage. And over that span, not including the Kraken years, he averaged a .920 save percentage. So he's got it in his track record. Everywhere else he's been above a .915, averaging at around a .920 save percentage. It just hasn't worked for him in Seattle for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure why it just hasn't worked for him, but I personally believe that the Kraken are the deepest team in the NHL right now. And last year, they were 8th in expected goals against. So there is nice team exposure, which you can see here, 78th percentile in terms of team expected goals against per game. The start volume was okay. It will probably grow given the fact that this year they shipped out Martin Jones. He actually just signed with Toronto, and their backup this year is Chris Driedger. So he did not play in 22-23. If you look at the last 3 seasons we have data for, 21-22, 24 starts, 9-14-1, 899 save percentage. 2021, 23 starts, 14-6-3 record, 927 save percentage. 19-20, 11 starts, 7-2-1 with a 938. So Grubauer is slated to start around 55 to 60 games this year, just based on how much Driedger has played historically, and that's in Florida and in Seattle. So he never really climbed above that 25 game threshold. So you're looking at Grubauer as a bona fide G1 because there's nobody pushing him for starts. It's not going to be a 1A, 1B situation. So you have that, the seas are parting for Grubauer to take over that net and become that guy. And if he can revert back anywhere in between the 60 to the 92 that he was a couple years ago, if he can get into this 73 to 80 range, that's what you're going to be looking for, especially if you're finding him after the fourth round in the draft. That's pretty much where you're going to have to start looking at him. I wouldn't look at him before that. I probably wouldn't even look at him in the fourth round. I would look a little bit later than that to try to find some value on him. But I do think that this is a guy who has a track record, and it just hasn't worked for him in Seattle. So let's see if he can turn it around this year. Now, up next is another guy I was high on last year, and it didn't work out, and that's Thatcher Demko. Now, this had a lot to do with injuries. He obviously was injured for a humongous chunk of the season, and he did kind of get his game turned around towards the end when he came back, but it was pretty much over at that point. But Demko has had, this is a very interesting file here because you have 3 years actually where he's in the 40s, a 42, that was very early in his career, 48, that was also early in his career. Then he massively jumps up to an 80 and then an 81, basically an 82 in 21-22, and then falls off a cliff last year. Now there was injuries mixed into that, but that's still a 42.92% deviation from his 21-22 rating. So there is some regression back up baked into his file. If you look at his numbers, a 901 save percentage is not great, but it's just slightly below average, and that mainly came up at the end of the year. He was a lot below that before he came back from his injury. So it's been kind of, touch and go. Last year was not the best year for him, but there is some optimism. So before Rick Tocchet got hired, Vancouver was 31st in the NHL in goals against per game at 3.98. After Rick Tocchet came in, they were 17th at 3.19. And I did a YouTube short when they made that coaching change, highlighting all of the things that Rick Tocchet has done in his career in the first year of taking over a team, how massively his teams jump in terms of defensive play. He is sort of I don't know if he's a hybrid, but he's definitely a defensive-minded coach in the sense that he brings his team goals against down. So a full year under Rick Tocchet, they do have some different personnel. They ship out Oliver Ekman-Larsson. They bring in a couple of other guys. So this could be a different blue line on paper, but for the most part, you still have Quinn Hughes. You still have some of the guys, Tyler Myers, etc. I don't know how that makes Vancouver Canuck fans feel, but nonetheless, even if he just gets back to the levels that he was at the previous 2 seasons, that would be a massive jump. If he can't get all the way there, even if he's in the 70 range, that's still kind of where the regression would end up, in the 65 to 70 range. And if you're getting him late in the draft, that would be ideal. Obviously, you're going to want him because he's a number 1 goaltender. There's not really a backup pushing him, so it's not a 1A, 1B, which is why he's a little bit higher on this list. We're looking for guys who are going to get a lot more starts. Now, he didn't have those last year, but that was because of injury. He would have probably gotten 55, 60 starts. So this is a guy that I'm looking at for a deep draft value, probably after the 6th or 7th round. I would start looking at Thatcher Demko. He's one of those guys that I've liked in the past for this reason. You can get him. This is his ceiling. This is his floor. He's going to end up either somewhere in between, or there's going to be some sort of a massive anomaly that will change the narrative completely. But I'm very high on Demko again this year. There's a couple of other guys I'm higher on, and obviously they're going to go earlier in the draft. But up next, this is one guy that I've been talking about in terms of a very unique 5-year trend, and that's Jacob Markstrom. So what you see here from Markstrom is 1 good year, 1 down year, 1 good year, 1 down year. And if that trend just simply continues, he's going to be potentially up above a 77 because he seems to outperform the previous high. So he had a 70, dropped to a 60, up to a 77, down to a 62. So his lows are getting higher and his highs are getting higher. So if you pencil all of that in theory, just looking at that logic, he should be around an 80 or something to that effect next year. Now, the bad news is over the last 2 seasons under Daryl Sutter, the Flames were 6th in the NHL last year in expected goals against and 1st in 21-22 when he put up this 77. So, new coach, maybe more offense comes from that, but who knows what happens on D. And for a goaltender with an .892 save percentage and only 1 shutout last year, that's not necessarily a good sign. However, he's very talented. He's been in Vezina contention before, so he is a guy who's been at the top of the league in various seasons. He had that one great season in Vancouver. He had a couple of decent seasons in Calgary. The first year in Calgary was not a success. The second year seemed to be what they were looking for in terms of why they signed him in free agency. Last year, it just didn't work for him. They could not get him going. I picked him up for a 5-game stretch or something last year, and it just wasn't working. So he ended up falling onto the waiver wire in a lot of leagues, which is kind of crazy to think about for a guy who started 58 games last year. So you're going to want to own him for the start volume. They're still going to try to ride him maybe 55, maybe 50 if they're really trying to limit his minutes, but I would probably put him in that 55 to 60 range. The wins weren't there because of the save percentage. The goals against is not that bad. And that's a team factor. Obviously, they were 6th in expected goals against, so the goals against should be low. They lost a lot of 1-goal games. They lost a lot of overtime games, and that will definitely hurt you last year. But this year, coming in with a new coach, maybe they get a couple of those wins in those 1-goal games in overtime and shootouts and whatnot, and that could potentially bump him up back closer to this 77 rating. And then typically this has been a goaltender that's really good for points leagues that favors wins and shutouts. You can see the 9 shutouts in 21-22. That was incredibly high. He's usually hovering around 3 or 4 per year, which is really good. Obviously, in that 5 to 7 range is elite, and then 9 is incredible. So he went from 9 shutouts to 1. So again, if you're following this trend, up, down, you would venture a guess that he's going to be up again. But even if he kind of splits the difference and is somewhere in the low 70s, that's going to be value depending on where he gets drafted. I don't think anybody's going to be jumping to try to pick him before the 7th or 8th round this year, just given the fact that if you owned him last year, he definitely burned you. Now, we have one more slide to go. The honorable mentions, just showing you what else went into this analysis project. There's a couple of other names on here that you may or may not have interest in. James Reimer came up here, and I made the mistake. I thought he was still in San Jose, but he actually signed in Detroit, and he could be the 1B behind Ville Husso. It'll be interesting because you could potentially handcuff those two guys together deep in the draft and get some excellent value on that, because I don't think anybody wants Reimer or Husso this year. So that could be an interesting play if you want to handcuff the two of them together. Kakkonen could be a starter again. Who knows how that's going to pan out, but he was a 70 in 21-22. He dropped 50% from that high. Eric Comrie had some injury issues, and I believe there's just no room for him in Buffalo in the crease this year. Obviously, Levi coming in is going to change that. They still have UPL, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen. They did lose Craig Anderson, but they still have a 3-headed monster if Comrie's trying to be an NHL goaltender this year. And then Jonathan Quick is an interesting case simply because Benoit Allaire is the goalie whisperer in New York. Every backup that comes into New York, with 1 or 2 exceptions, comes in and plays really well, puts up at least a league average save percentage and wins some games. So that could be interesting if you have Shesterkin that you're going to pick in the first round. You shouldn't do that anyway, but let's say you get Shesterkin. Maybe you want to handcuff him with Quick, get access to that Rangers team that's probably going to be a 100-point team again this year. That could be an interesting play, and he's fallen 43% from his 21-22 rating. He's basically a backup now, and he had an atrocious save percentage last year, so not a lot is going to make him look valuable in terms of when you're in the draft and people are looking at stats. And then other than that, there's one other guy that I wanted to include in this video, and that was Spencer Knight. I'm going to include him in my top 5 injured players video that will be coming out in probably a couple weeks. Haven't started putting that together yet, but there's a number of injured players that are going to provide you value, and I do think Spencer Knight is one of those guys. You can see his 21-22 rating is a 70. He's fallen 35% from that. He was in the player assistance program. There's other stuff going on. His play has fallen off a cliff, maybe because of that. By all accounts, he was back. He was at the prospect development camp, just getting some reps in, and we'll see. I don't know if he's going to be effective as a backup to Bobrovsky, but I simply don't trust Bobrovsky in fantasy hockey, so this could be an interesting play going forward, but that will be a topic for another video. That's going to do it for this one. If you watched all the way through to the end, I want to thank you for doing that. Remember to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, all that stuff. I'm still posting on Threads and Instagram if you're interested in following me there, at data_draft. And that's going to do it for this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.